So, hi everyone. My name is Madeline Dyer, and I write YA fiction, poetry, and memoir. Today, I'm joined by Gila Green, who's an Israel-based writer, editor, and EFL teacher. Gila writes novels, short stories, flash fiction, poetry, and essays. And we're going to be chatting today about YA fiction and specifically why it's important that YA fiction looks at global issues. So, hi Gila. Do you want to start by telling viewers a bit about yourself, like who you are as a writer? Because you write such a wide variety of things, and I'm really interested to know like how this came about.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. I have that in common with you. I really enjoy talking to people and, of course, especially writers all over the world. So thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm Canadian originally, and I've been living in Israel for, we're just going to leave it at more than 20 years now. Just leave it at that and I have, it's true, I'd never set out to write a variety of fiction topics. Wasn't like a prearranged goal or something like that, but it certainly has evolved that I'm writing about a really wide variety of things, different countries, different issues. And I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I personally need a lot of stimulation, and I just frankly, I feel like I constantly need new challenges. I constantly have to tackle something else as a person. And then as a writer, I want to expand my canvas. There's nothing wrong with it. Obviously, there's great things about just getting really, really great at one particular thing. But I also want to sort of challenge myself and see if I can expand my canvas. I've said this in other interviews. I had a conversation with a writing partner of mine once that really stood out to me, where she said she feels that a lot of authors are really just writing the same book over and over again. That if you really analyze the book, they're changing the characters and they're moving things around, but the essential themes or messages are basically the same. And that just scared me, really. I was like, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want people to be feeling like down the line like this is really just the same book. Even though, again, I think that does work for some people and some art forms. They just do it better. They give the audiences more of what they already want. But I personally, that idea didn't appeal to me. So I think that's one of the reasons you'll find a lot of variety. And maybe another reason is because I live in a very expat neighborhood. I'm just constantly, I don't realize it unless I go overseas. But when I'm here, you're just in the course of a regular day, if you are allowed to go out more than 100 meters from your house. But let's say pre-corona days, when we were going out, in a regular day, I could be talking to somebody who's Australian, South African, American, Ethiopian, Israeli. It's just a very, very mixed environment here. Mm-hmm. So that prompts a lot of interests. Just on a lot of different topics.
Okay. Yeah, like I love talking to other writers who also write in more than one form, because it is so interesting. And what you're saying about sort of like constantly wanting to sort of like experiment and like stretch yourself as a writer, I really agree with, because like I just love experimentation, and I find that really helpful, like on a craft level, just to like constantly be striving to improve. Yeah, like I know with my own work, I'm predominantly drawn to writing YA fiction, but I also write memoir. But I found like when I write memoir, it's like a very specific thing that I will need to write at that point. So like my first memoir that released is actually a poetry collection. It's a memoir in poetry, and I wrote that when I was suffering from brain inflammation and I couldn't function cognitively very well. So like I really struggled with prose, but I still needed to find a way to sort of like hold on to my identity as a writer. So that's how I very much turned to poetry at that point. So it's both to help me sort of like maintain my identity as a writer and to feel that I was still a writer, but it also helped me sort of process everything and understand everything that I was experiencing and going through. So I found that when I'm sort of like using different forms, and like, because I also write personal essays as well, and it's very sort of time specific to like certain things that are going on in my life. And like ordinarily, like YA fiction is just like the main thing that I'm drawn to. But even at the moment, like, because like I started off writing speculative fiction, like, so like my first novel was dystopian, but I'm just sort of like now like exploring more contemporary and thriller and sort of like psychological thrillers within the YA genre. So yeah, like I just find that what I need to write at a certain time very much changes, and it does change like year to year, and it's very much based on the things that I'm experiencing. So yeah, is there like a form that currently speaks to you more than others, or do you just take it day by day in terms of what you'll be focusing on? Like, do you have multiple projects on the go at once as well?
I'm not the kind of writer in terms of my own personal fiction. I'm not somebody who likes to work on multiple projects. I know writers like that. They're working on a play, they're working on a story collection, they're working on a novel. I have sort of by professional work, let's say paid work. If I'm commissioned to write an essay, for something, then that I can do at the same time. Sort of, I can differentiate between professional. When I say professional, I mean like I have to earn a living, like work, and my projects. But I'm not, working on different projects at the same time. And the truth is, I don't really like it. Sometimes it's happened to me recently where something's come back to me. Let's say a manuscript I haven't looked at in a long time. Someone sends me back the editing, but I'm working on a new, let's say for this particular novel we're talking about here, the YA, the No Entry, it's supposed to be an environmental series. So if I'm working on the sequel to the series and someone sends me back the editing for something else, I don't even particularly like doing that, because I find that when I'm in the book, I'm living the book, actually living in the book. I'm thinking about those characters. Those characters are absolutely real to me. I'm thinking about them before I fall asleep. What would they do? What would they say? What's going to happen? And so to sort of world hop like that, I actually, some people even recommend it, to writers, and they advise it. I just, that doesn't work for me. I think you have to do what works for you. I also like to finish projects.
Yeah.
I like to start them and I like to finish them. So also the multiple project for me just kind of makes me procrastinate more. It just throws me. So I work on one thing, but then, like I said, on the flip side, I'll need a lot of variety. So then once I finish it, I'll go and I'll look for something dramatically different.
Right.
So that's kind of, I guess, a variation maybe that people need to hop from different projects at the same time. I just need to hop from different projects entirely. And what's important is knowing what works for you. If it works for you in the middle of the novel because you're getting frustrated to take a break and work on short stories, then by all means. And I agree with what you said before. I mean, a lot of times I look back at what I wrote, let's say 10 years ago, and I don't think I could write that today.
Yeah.
Sometimes I even think, like, who wrote this? And I even if I had to write it today, I couldn't. So it would be in a different place or in a different age. Your writing is almost like a chronicle of your own headspace in a way. So I agree with that very much. But again, the mainstream advice is sort of make a name for yourself in a very specific genre. If you're going to be a romance writer, be the romance writer. Stick to that genre. Get well known. So I'm not necessarily giving the best commercially driven advice, shall we say. So that also depends on what your goals are.
Yeah, so yeah, I've sort of like experienced that because like I write such like a wide range of things. So like I've got sort of like dystopian and science fiction and fantasy out like all for a YA audience, but then I've also got a poetry collection out, like which is my memoir and poetry under the same name, and then I've got sort of like educational like awareness essays about different types of chronic illness as well. So yeah, my writing sort of like is spread quite like far over a lot of different topics, but yeah, I found that does work for me. And as you say, it's not sort of like the most sort of like best thing to do from a commercial perspective, but I find that my writing is just so important to me, and I'm very connected to it, but I need to write sort of like what I feel I need to write at that point, and I can't really sort of like be told that, oh, you must write this kind of thing now and then move on to this. Like I have to sort of like connect to it on sort of like a very emotional level, and if I'm not in that right headspace to write that thing at that point, then it just doesn't work really. So but yeah, I do sort of like work on multiple projects at the same time, but I sort of like I'll be working on like fiction, but then I also have like my memoir in progress, and I just sort of like delve into like the memoir and like just like dip into it whenever I feel that I need to add a bit, or if I feel that I want to work on it. Whereas like my fiction is the one where I'm more like disciplined with, and like I've got like deadlines with my agent and stuff, so that does help me sort of like keep focused on sort of one project. But I do find that I do need sort of like a second project on the go just to sort of almost free me up a bit, like creatively. So yeah. Anyway, you mentioned your latest YA book. So do you want to tell viewers a bit about it now?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask you though about that. Has your agent ever recommended that you publish the nonfiction under a different name, or vice versa?
Well, we haven't really sort of like had that much of a conversation about it yet, because I'm still working on sort of like the full length memoir, because I got like the poetry collection, which is quite small, and then we're working on like this memoir that like she's quite excited in. So I don't know, because like I have written a lot of personal essays as well, which are all about the same sort of like illness that my memoir is about, and they're already published under my like same name as my fiction. So I have sort of like got this readership under my name, Madeline Dyer, for both fiction and for like the personal essays, non-fiction memoir. So yeah, I'm not really sure like what's going to happen like going forward with like the non-fiction, because like it is really different to the fiction. But then on the other hand, because like my memoir is about my experiences with brain inflammation, and then in my latest YA manuscript, I've written the main characters having the same type of brain inflammation. So I can see a lot of crossover between the two when I look at it from like certain angles. But yeah, like I'll have to ask her what she thinks about sort of like whether I continue to do like everything under the same name, because it does make it a bit chaotic, and like especially like I know when I was working on my website and trying to sort of like separate my work into like fiction and non-fiction, and then I've got poetry that's also non-fiction and memoir. Like just for categorizing it, I found it really difficult at times because there is like overlap.
Right. Well, and also the question is if when you're writing, if you have a different audience in mind, or if you don't.
Yeah, I do like have different audiences in mind. Like, well, particularly like my fiction, because it's all like YA fiction, and although I'm moving into sort of like YA thrillers, it's very much sort of the same readership as with my speculative fiction. But yeah, my personal essays and memoir and the poetry, that has drawn in like an entire new sort of like audience. So I am getting sort of like a little bit of crossover between the two, but I have found that it is mainly sort of like quite separate. So that's quite interesting, and I don't know whether that would make it mean that it would make more sense to use like a separate name in the future for that. I'm not sure, and I'm not exactly sure like how much more sort of like non-fiction I'm gonna write after I've finished this like memoir, because I'm like nearing the end of like a pretty solid draft for it now. But I can't really see myself writing like a lot of memoir after that. So yeah,
Right.
it's really interesting to think about. But yeah, I find if I just spend too much time thinking about it, I get so bogged down in like all of those details, I don't end up sort of like writing it.
Yeah. No, I hope I do this one day. I've always wanted to. You know, you read these articles about these writers who, let's say they're querying a novel, okay, to an agent or to publishing houses, it doesn't matter. And let's say they get a certain amount of rejections, you know, let's say a lot, you know, like 50 or 70. But they're convinced it's good. They've shown it to professional editors. You know, they know it's on a level. So they'll go and they'll change the name on the query letter.
Yeah.
Right? They'll use a man's name if they're female, or they'll use, you know, like I've always wondered if I just used a name like Sue, or like, you know, a much more common name, if I would get a different reaction. And then of course they'll write these articles that they query the exact same thing, they change the name, and then they get a response like right away. Otherwise they wouldn't be publishing the article, right? You know, to show I've always thought that one day I'd like to do something like that, just to see for yourself how much the recipient is influenced by the sender rather than the work. So like that's something, I don't know, that's something I want to do sometimes. I don't know if every writer wants to do that, or I'm just, odd, but just to see, once you've tried it under the name you're used to using, so that you can compare.
Yeah.
Not right away using different names, then that's not gonna tell you anything. But it would be really interesting. But that's just me getting off on the side. So this novel, right, which I wanted to show you before, No Entry. Let me see the camera. You can see how good my physics is a YA environmental novel. So it's called environmental fiction or eco-fiction. That was initially published in September 2019 in Australia with Stormbird Press, which is a nonprofit environmental press. And it follows daring heroine Yael Amar, who is 17, and before the novel begins, her brother is killed in a terrorist attack that takes place in Canada, in Montreal, and her parents are South African, and in order to help them cope with their grief, they decide to go back to South Africa for a year to sort of, get away from the place he lived in and where they were with him, and to go to South Africa for a year. And she's an animal lover, and she decides to go ahead of them and go on an elephant conservation program. And there she gets all involved, and she discovers a poaching ring, and she decides that she's going to, take it down and put a stop to it. And she's got a great boyfriend, and she meets a new best friend, and it's her adventure that takes place entirely in South Africa's Kruger National Park. I don't know if you've ever gone to the bush, but Kruger National Park is a very famous safari. It's enormous. It's larger than all of Israel. You could spend days and still be driving in Kruger National Park. So it's a very famous place to travel. And it actually came out in September 2019, but just after the launch, I don't know if anyone still remembers with what's going on now, but there were these enormous bushfires in Australia that really did massive destruction. And Stormbird Press is actually located on Kangaroo Island. That completely burnt down. They lost everything. The press burnt down. The equipment burned down. The physical books burned down. Everything was burned to the ground. They really had a terrible tragedy and a disaster there. And then, so we were sort of planning a kind of relaunch, because already, right, the fires were burning. Like, I didn't realize, because I just thought I wasn't getting a hold of them, because they didn't have internet connection, and a lot of the staff were actually leaving their positions to volunteer firefight. But I couldn't really tell what was going on, and I had been invited to the Vancouver Jewish Book Festival when we were still allowed to travel, which was taking place in February. It's hard to believe that I went to Vancouver in February, but I did. So I was planning for this festival, and I didn't even realize how bad it was. And then by the middle of December, they were just no more. They had sort of planned a kind of relaunch for March, April. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the COVID-19 entered. So they sort of had two disasters, one after the other. But hopefully, they are not giving up, and they're going to make a comeback. And it's planned to be like this novel is the first in an environmental series. So I've written the sequel, and we'll see how that goes.
How many books have you planned for the series then?
Right now, I really only have 3 books planned for the series. I wrote the second one, also took place in Kruger National Park. Mm-hmm. But of course, I changed she's not on a elephant conservation program. She's doing more drone training. I changed the type of program and her position. It's not the same book. but I don't think I could do a third novel in that same location. Now, Safari, the bush is a very, very specific
Yeah.
location.
Mhm.
So I can't imagine doing a third one. Obviously I did a ton of research. I actually flew to South Africa at one point when I was writing the book, just sort of refresh myself. YouTube is extremely helpful for location. I obviously had to do a lot of research on elephant poaching and elephant conservation because they're all actually animal conservationists. I'm not, I was just interested
Mhm.
because I had read that our grandchildren probably won't see elephants except for in a zoo, and that they're on the brink of extinction, and people are just not aware. And then I just started reading more and more about what's going on with them, which again is related to this COVID-19, this kind of invading animal space, and then having it really come back to bite you the more you go into their spaces. Um, so it is related to what's going on right now. And then so the third one, I would have to move it, either go into the city, like into Cape Town, or I made like she's from Canada, her best friend is from New York. I gave the ability that I could like go somewhere else,
Right. Yeah.
a different location because of the sort of narrowness of Kruger. Maybe if you were a ranger who had just decades of experience out there, but to try to constantly use the setting, I didn't think would be a good idea. But I'll go by feedback. If people
Yeah.
love it, if people love it there, then we'll stay there.
Yeah.
So
So yeah, your whole series is very much sort of like about these global issues like affecting the environment. And yeah, I just think like the YA genre is like really, it's a really good place to sort of like explore these issues. And um yeah, like with my own books, I've got the Untamed series. Here is book one. And um oh, I always forget where the camera is every time I hold it up.
lovely cover, really nice.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so yeah, my series, this is book one. It explores sort of like human rights violations, and it's set in a dystopian world. And um, like the second book also focuses more sort of like on women's rights in particular, but the whole series is very much about like human rights violations. And yeah, I think the dystopian genre really allows for important global issues to be examined in a way where sort of like these dystopian worlds are created on sort of like the basis of a global issue that has become really prominent through like man's own decision to do something. So yeah, because I was just thinking about this earlier actually in preparation for this conversation, and like a lot of YA dystopian works in particular do focus on like these global issues. So like the Hunger Games, it's like the rich poor divide, and I was just thinking about how sort of like flexible sort of the YA genre is for exploring these different issues, like not just for like dystopian and speculative fiction, but like even sort of like on a contemporary level, and like you've got like sort of like thrillers as well that are very much about sort of like issues that do affect like us globally. So yeah, I think it's really important to include like these global issues in YA literature, and like it's just this really good space to sort of like make your point, but it also like it's done in a way that isn't sort of like preachy, and it doesn't feel that we're like necessarily trying to make like a huge point about it, because we sort of like our books cover so many other different things as well. And I know that some of the topics that sort of especially like YA is moving towards examining, like poverty, immigration, racism, terrorism. um, Traditionally, I know like a lot of people would think that they're sort of like better suited to adult fiction because they're like really sort of like serious topics. And yeah, I just completely disagree with that, because YA is a really good space to explore these things. But I know that when I've told some people that like I write books for young adults, they've sort of reacted as if I've said that like I'm writing these books that are just sort of like adult books but dumbed down just to make it like a nice children's story. So I think we have this stereotype that children's books and young adult literature, um, a lot of people kind of think that they can't sort of like tackle these serious issues because they think that if it does, it sort of then moves into like the adult fiction territory.
Mhm.
And like that just annoys me so much because YA fiction is just like a great place to explore really important issues. And yeah,
Are you finding that feedback is more from readers or more from the publishing community when you
I
say
found
that?
it was more from readers. Just like sort of like when I was just speaking to sort of like colleagues and friends and like people that like I went to school with, just sort of like catching up with them later on, they just kind of assumed that like YA books just sort of are easier to write than adult books and not as complex, and they don't cover like important things. Because I remember at one point I was like considering writing an adult novel, and one of my friends from school said to me something like, "Oh, well, that'll be a lot more difficult than writing a YA book." And I was just thinking, well, I wouldn't like, yeah, like YA is just like so complex and it covers like really serious things as well. So yeah, I find it really interesting, sort of like the perceptions that people have, especially when you sort of like look at how global issues are sort of like becoming more prominent in YA fiction.
So I think that there's different, it depends. That's why I asked you who the feedback is from. Because let's say as a parent with a lot of teenage girls who like are big readers, I do see that I want to know what they're reading. I do want to see what they're reading when they had recently, well, recently, not so recently, but fairly recently, let's say that whole series about 13 Reasons Why and all this suicide. So I be honest with you, I don't know if that was ever a book. I don't know if it was a book first or if it came out as a series or if there's a book like that. Actually, was it a book?
It was,
No.
yeah.
Oh, it was a book. So I would want to know if my daughter was reading that book. Let's say very unfortunately, she has had, one of my daughters has had that situation with a friend who is unfortunately no longer with us today. So it would be important to me as a parent to know if that had happened to her with a friend and then she picks up this book. Not to not write it, but I would want to know that she was reading that and to discuss it with her. And, I would want to know about it. So on one hand, I write YA, so I agree that YA can certainly tackle a lot of really important issues and should. But it doesn't mean that I would necessarily agree with the way that every YA writer went about doing it, which is natural. There's no such thing as choosing a way and everybody agrees with you. There isn't one way to do anything. So from that perspective, I think you do, because in a way you sort of, even when you're marketing, you're almost marketing those books to parents, right? Or even grandparents who are going to buy, you want to buy, like we're planning to do for No Entry, we're already planning a Christmas package for it. You're going to be aiming at parents, grandparents, like, does your kid love animals? Here's a Christmas package of, environmental books, that kind of thing. So there is that aspect. I certainly know I've heard from other writers, let's say with mental illness, there were parents who weren't happy to explore characters with mental illness. And it can be done, and it depends, who's doing it. But of course, not everyone is going to agree on that. But I think certainly for me, with the elephant extinction and poaching, it was more from the perspective that we've tried, and a lot of people are still really trying, but in the big picture, we have failed. Elephants are being slaughtered at the rate of 55 a day. There are more elephants being poached than coming into the world. So we have really tried, and some things there have been improvements, but we have largely failed the elephant. You also have to take into account that the elephant tusks, this is purely, there's no reason to poach them. It's purely greed. It's purely aesthetics, people making jewelry out of them and art and chess pieces and what. It's not something that someone could argue, and I'm not taking a side on it, but it's not someone arguing, well, we need to eat cows, we need to drink milk. There's no reason, there is no argument to slaughter these animals that can live till they're 60, 70 years old. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever. So it's pure greed. It's true that some religions or tribes believe that elephant tusks have medicinal powers, but they don't. They don't have medicinal powers. They can't cure you of anything. So the reason I chose YA was more from the sense of like, okay, we're going to keep trying, but we didn't do so well. So we really need to get younger people to understand that this is something that if they don't take on, they are going to be showing their kids pictures of elephants. They're going to become like unicorns, which is a massive tragedy. So there's the hope aspect of what you're trying to do. It's true. You really have to be careful what you said about the preachy aspect, being preachy and shoving it down their throats. And of course, there's more to the story. She's grappling with things, and a lot of the reader feedback I got was they really related to Yael, and it's still a coming of age story that that a lot of teens can relate to. However, that they are really the hope of the future. So there's that aspect. Well, people who say to you it's easier to write, well, again, that's like saying, is it easier to play the piano or the violin? I mean, as a book editor, people have come to me trying to write YA, let's say, with their manuscripts, and it's an enormous struggle for them to get away from an adult voice. They just sound like adults. They just sound like adults. There's way too much self-reflection. There's way too much analysis. Could be because I have a house full of teens at the moment, so I'm just surrounded by it. But they just don't do that. They don't do that. They don't use this kind of language that we would use. Things either are amazing or they suck, or they have a very different way of speaking. And then if you're talking about dystopian, so I don't know what you've done with technology and dystopian, but if it's contemporary, once you have to throw in Instagram and social media, then they have a whole other language that even adults who use Instagram are by and large not using. So it is extremely difficult for some people, way harder than adult. So it just depends. And how much you remember being that age, or how much you can eavesdrop and listen to other people. For some people, it's basically impossible. Like they need to stick to adult, really. So there's no real answer to that. Is it what's harder?
Like you can't really sort of like compare the two because they are like so different, and you are writing for different readerships. But yeah, to say like that writing like young adult is just like dumbing down an adult novel is just like completely wrong. So
no, you have to think of it. I would advise more like acting. I mean, is it easier to act out a 40-year-old, or is it easier to take on the role of a 15 or 16-year-old? It's not. I don't know if you hear actors. I certainly can't think of listening to actors say, well, it's so much easier. You took the role of the teenager.
Yeah, like
like you got the hard role of the adult.
Yeah.
If you just sort of flip it to a different art form, you'll see that it doesn't hold. And certain actors, whatever they do, they just, they don't naturally, like younger roles aren't going to resonate with them.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually about sort of like using sort of like a different industry just to like combat anyone who is saying that. So yeah, I'll have to remember that one.
Yeah, if you went to a play, you wouldn't say like, oh, well, she got the easy role. Like, of the 13-year-olds.
Yeah,
So
what you're saying about sort of like getting into the mindset of like a teenager if they're writing young adult, and like with technology as well, that's like I found that really interesting because like at the moment I've been sort of working on young adult thrillers, and I've been sort of like incorporating social media into sort of like the plot a bit more than like I have done before. Because like in my dystopian society, like my main characters don't have access to the technology because they're sort of like the oppressed people who are being controlled by it. So there's not really sort of like the social media aspect in my dystopian novels from like the oppressed point of view. But yeah, in my thrillers, I've sort of like I keep sort of like finding that I don't know sort of like the current social media that like teenagers are actively using because like I had it all like that they were using Facebook, and then one of my beta readers told me that like teenagers don't use Facebook anymore. Oh no, what do they use? But yeah, just like staying up to date. But do you think if you sort of like mention social media in a YA book, do you think it would like date it more than sort of like if you didn't?
if you're writing a contemporary novel, I don't see how you can write an authentic contemporary novel. What you can do, again, is you've got your setting. So let's say if Yael is in Kruger Park, I know that in Kruger Park, you don't always have good connection. You're out in the wilderness. So I can sort of get away from the constant, let's say, a regular teenager walking down the street in Jerusalem or New York or London is going to be with the phone, constantly the phone, right? They're going to go for eats with the phone. I can get away from it by saying, oh, I don't have connection again, or that. So because of her location, but I think you have to, it's like any device, you can't overuse it or will seem dated, but I don't see how you can have a teenager who doesn't, WhatsApp her friend or say, let's take a photo and save this for later. I just don't see how that's just not going to be 2019. I think it's an interesting question. I see now, let's say, a lot on writers groups with social media where everybody's asking, do I have to mention this virus? So are they going to set everything into 18 so that like just before there's the COVID-19, or are they going, or is the whole book like I was going to be constantly mentioning this? So, but I don't think social media is exactly the same as that. Hopefully not. Hopefully it doesn't stick around that long. But I do think you have to mention it. I do think there are creative ways to minimize it. There are people. So if I think something, I don't remember exactly, but something like 30% of young adult readers are adults. There's always that statistic. There's this. So probably you're going to have a lot of adults. Like I have, let's say, a beta reader that she just can't stand it. She can't stand reading the texting conversations, or the WhatsApp conversations, the SMS, whatever it is. She can't stand it, and it really bothers her. So she'll just put it like, sorry, you can't read this, even though she knows that I have to put that in.
Yeah.
Because of course, it's not realistic to think that someone is going to drive, get a flat tire, and not text their friend or call somebody. It's not going to happen. That's what everyone's going to do today. They're not just going to sit there and wait for someone to pass by and wave them down. They're going to call someone. They have a phone. So, but yeah, you put them in locations where they don't have it, or you can be creative, where the two of them as friends can decide we're not going on social media this week or whatever. But the truth is, it's also extremely helpful. It can give you lots of ways to, like you said, to work with your plots that writers didn't have. They always tell you can't have sort of magical godliness come and save. Some god can't come down and just get your heroine out of a jam, right? It's one of the first things you learn is readers don't like it when, someone just walks in and like, poof, they have the antidote, and so she gets the cure and she's cured. But in some ways, social media is like that. They can be stuck somewhere. I have that scene here in No Entry where she gets, I'll get separated from the other two, and the other two are in a very dangerous situation. She doesn't want to be seen by them, so she's hiding, and she drops her location And, that's going to help her. So it does give you those tools. So why not use them? That's what people would do in a contemporary situation. So
exactly.
I think you should use it. Yeah.
Yeah, like last year, I was at a crime writing festival, and I remember one of the questions that was asked to the crime authors was about social media and like whether it should be sort of like incorporated into plots. And I think it was C.L. Taylor who answered the question, and she was saying about how in thrillers and crime, social media offers like this extra sort of like, it can sort of become an antagonist in itself, and you've got like this extra threat with just how much information is available on social media for people now. And she said that she was definitely aware of a lot more books that used social media as like a plot device to sort of like make the protagonist like more sort of like either closed off from being able to get help, or like being sort of a thing that put them more at danger and more at risk. So
yeah, or discover something, you walk in and the Facebook page is open, if the person's over 45. Since my kids certainly think that Facebook is for grandparents, exclusively. They can't even imagine going on Facebook. Phones can be open, phones can be switched. There's no reason any more than, when they invented cars, you're not going to not use cars. But it's true that, perhaps maybe in 10 years there won't be any such thing as Twitter. Could be. I've seen Malcolm Gladwell. I've seen interviews with him. I don't know if you ever read any of his books or. So he writes nonfiction. He's a historian. I've listened to all his podcasts, and one of he's said that he doesn't think Twitter will exist in a decade or two. He doesn't think it will. But so what? Again, it's like anything. If it's used correctly, it's going to be great. I wouldn't have it in every chapter on every, and you wouldn't want to overdo, but that you could say the same thing for foreshadowing or having twins or.
Yeah, you've got to get the balance right so that it doesn't sort of like dominate at all.
But it wouldn't be realistic unless they were in a location.
Yeah.
Like I said, it wouldn't be realistic if in my case, if she was on social media all day, because anyone who's ever been out in the wild knows you don't have that kind of connection.
Yeah.
So since I'm very, location is very important to me. And I think location should be treated like a character in the novel.
Definitely.
So you really need to know the location and what could really happen there.
So which YA books do you recommend then that examine global issues?
So as I mentioned, let's say with mental health issues, there's another really good writer here, YA, Leah Schreiber, and I just finished reading her recent book, which did have a character with who had schizophrenia, which is something very difficult to touch in YA. But as I say, she is, for example, a pediatrician. So she has a tremendous amount of medical knowledge. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be a doctor to write it, because as I told you, I'm not an animal conservationist, and here I'm doing this eco-fiction. I mean, of course, you can research, and because I think of writing so much like acting, you can inhabit and you can research. But it certainly helps when you have a character who has to go to a lot of doctor's visits or institutions, and how things would go. If you don't have that, you can interview people who do, right? I mean, I've never shot a gun in my life, but I wanted her to go to one of the shooting ranges, because there are a lot of shooting ranges near Kruger Park. So I had to interview people who have been to shooting ranges and who have shot guns, and ask them, like, and go over it. I'm not saying there aren't other ways to get it, but it certainly, I think, would give you a lot more confidence in such a delicate subject if you had. So she tends to tackle those kind of issues. I think also in the space I'm writing in with No Entry on Jean Sherman, she also tackles the elephant space issue. And she told me I I took elephants, so she's not going to go for elephants, but she's put out a trilogy, a younger YA, which is also that's a different topic than his 17 YA isn't 14-year-old YA. I don't know how old is your YA?
About 17.
17. So you know that it would be different if they were 14.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, or 13. So it's a little bit different. It's not middle grade, but it's definitely different. She's tackling a lot of she's really coming at it more holistically. She's also taking animals and vegan issues, whereas I'm really sticking to the elephant conservation and not like mixing a lot of issues. So she's also someone I would recommend. I'm not as familiar with the dystopian um, um, genre, even though I know it's very popular, and I know in my house there's stacks of these books. I know the girls, I don't know about the boys because my son's older, but they just love these. I don't know also if it was as popular when I was that age or if it's really in now. I don't remember it being this crazy popular. But that might be just because we didn't have social media then and I couldn't see it popping up all the time. That could be. Maybe it was just as popular then. But like you said, I think those can tackle a lot of issues. Is it because dystopian is more flexible that you feel like it's easier to write about, let's say, human rights, not contemporary fiction? Because it drags you down with the facts.
Yeah, like it does provide sort of like this level for escapism as well. But I found that when I was writing my Untamed series, like I knew from the start that I wanted it to explore sort of like human rights violations and what happens when people are like having their human rights taken away by another group. So I very much built that into my world building, like right from the start. And then like it's very much a survival story and it's got a lot of action, it's very fast paced. But underlying it all, you have got these global issues that do run through. And pretty much every dystopian book that I've read, the world building does link very strongly to one particular global issue. So like poverty is a big one, and with like the rich poor divide, because that's like used in the Hunger Games to show like inequality that way. And I suppose it's because a lot of these global issues do like link to inequality on some level, that it then becomes like the dystopian genre becomes a very good space to explore it, because typically in dystopian, the main character is fighting for equality and fighting to make the circumstances that they are living in better for them and for everyone else. So it's very much sort of like it does get quite political, the genre, but not in like a like preachy way. It's very sort of like um it teaches teenagers as well that like they do have a voice, and because like in these YA dystopians, these sort of like the revolutions are led by teenagers. So I find like I know when I was a teenager and reading like dystopians, I found it like it gave me a lot of hope that like if I wasn't happy with something, I would still be able to change it. And just because like I was young, it didn't necessarily mean that my ideas were less important. So I think that like YA dystopian does give a lot of hope to teenagers. And also like the teenage years are like can be very confusing and like with a lot of changes happening, and just sort of like being able to find a protagonist who you can like root for and identify with. I find that I found that so helpful. And yeah, and bringing in sort of like the wider sort of like global issues as well into the world building and showing how like these characters know that they need change and are aware that it's a problem. Like I just found that so sort of like interesting, and I was just really motivated to write it. But yeah, like with my current work, it's like YA thriller, so it's sort of like very contemporary setting. But I have found that I'm sort of like, because like I'm writing these thrillers after having had brain inflammation and chronic illness, and like the brain inflammation did cause neuropsychiatric symptoms. So I was like getting hallucinations and psychosis due to sort of like the physical effects on my brain. So in my thrillers, like I'm very much sort of like focusing more on mental health and physical health and examining sort of like stereotypes that people sort of have already constructed around these things. Because like I know when a doctor first told me like that I had psychosis, um, I felt very negatively about that and almost ashamed because, like in a lot of like films, traditionally, the only person that would have psychosis is the villain, and it's used as a way to show that they're more evil. So that is just something that, like, in my latest thriller that I've actually just sent it off to my agent a week or so ago. I've got my main character who has psychosis, and it's like it's a thriller, so it's not like completely about her illness that's causing the psychosis, but it is showing that even though she has psychosis, she can still like do all these other things, and that she's not just her illness. So I think that's like really important for me to explore, and sort of like trying to sort of break down the stigma around mental health as well. Like I think that's just so important.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I've got another YA novel called A Prayer Apart, which I'm looking for an agent for now. And I had a beta reader read it very recently. And I have a character there that this is a completely different novel. It's set in Israel in 2014, which I'm now learning 2014 is like historical fiction at this point. I thought it was contemporary, when I wrote to her, and then when she said back, she's like, "This isn't contemporary, it's 2014." I'm like, okay, so it's history apparently, which is weird, when you think about it. But the truth is, the world is so different, right?
Yeah.
So it's written then, and he has it's also a male hero, which again now certainly from the commercial aspect, female heroines are very, very popular. But I felt this story, like we've already said in the beginning, we write what we want, we write where our emotions take us, and we don't necessarily follow like some kind of trend. So I do have a male hero, which was also, again, going back to what we said in the beginning, I wanted to see, can I have a convincing 17-year-old male voice? Can I do that as a female? I was very challenged to do that. And interestingly, in the very, 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 very first draft, years ago, I had tried to do two voices, a male voice, like him and his sister, and to switch between them. And it didn't matter who read it. It was like, the male voice is so much stronger. Just write the whole thing from his point of view. You can't really have one person overpower. When you're reading a book and it's changing person and you're waiting to get back to the person you really like. And across the board, interestingly, when I thought, how am I going to do a convincing teenage boy who has grown up in the Middle East? How am I going to do that? That's, I grew up in Canada. Obviously, I'm not male. How am I going to do that? And ironically, across the board, everyone said the female voice is much weaker and just so much less interesting. Just do the whole thing. So he he's in a lockdown school, which is like one step before actual juvenile detention, sort of a last chance, what we would have called last chance like if you can't make it here, you're going to actually juvenile jail. So it's like a rehabilitation high school. And in a lot of these schools, I don't know what happens overseas, but in Israel, there isn't always enough space. So you have people who have behavioral problems and people who have emotional problems and some who have both. But there isn't always space to have exactly where you should be in every school. So it can happen that someone who has no behavioral problems at all, doesn't have any conduct disorder, or anything, has emotional problems or depression, emotional problems, ends up in a school for boys with behavioral problems because there's just no space for that. Yeah. And they have to go somewhere. So, that's just the reality of the world. The world isn't like neat and precise. So he ends up with a roommate like that who really shouldn't be there. And that brings out his protective side. But the point of my story is that I had thought so much about why his roommate, his name is Avi, why Avi is there for the hero, who's Daniel. But I hadn't thought of it the other way around. And I happened to send it to a reader. And a lot of times you have a reader today, again, because of social media, you don't really know, right? You've met them on I met her on a Canadian writers group, and we just exchanged work. So we don't really get into our personal life. We just talk about what we're doing, and then you want to exchange. It's not it's not a matchmaking service it's a matchmaking service, but for writers, not for your personal life. And then when she wrote back, she said, I have I really love that character. It's the first time that anyone read it. I really loved Avi because I've got, she called him a mentally challenged son. I don't remember exactly which phrase she used, but something like that. And you just did that so well. And that was really, you can be working on a book for years and so many different people read it and no one has mentioned that character once. No one's brought it up. And for her, that was such a big thing to see someone who she saw her son in this person who, like you said, who was a very positive aspect. He needed a boy like this to bring out his protective side and make him much less aggressive and to make him realize that he was actually the type of bully who would bully a boy like this. And now this was going to bring out, because they were roommates, he was going to protect him. So I was only thinking about how someone like that could help the hero, but not how a reader who was raising someone like that in their home would react. So that was just really, really nice. Because it's that you don't even see everything in your own work.
No.
Right? You see it only for your own purposes. Like, I need a foil for this hero. What's my foil going to be? Type of thing. And then what are his issues? Well, if he's a bully, I need someone who gets bullied. Mm-hmm. So it is really important. That's encouraging me in the new YA novel that I'm working on now to bring in another character like that. Maybe I could do that again, because I do think, exactly as you said, that mental illness has to be. I had woven him in so naturally that I didn't even think of him like that. But mental illness, those type of characters have to be even more woven in than they are, in this kind of seamless way. Like you said, that doesn't mean the whole book is about that. The whole book isn't about that by any stretch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think
besides saying, like, I'm going to make this an issue book, like this illness book, even though that's also fine. Mm-hmm. But no, just have seamless characters.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and just show that these characters who have mental illness, they're not completely defined by it, and they do have like other sort of like characteristics as well. Because like a lot of the time when I was reading, like it applies more like a few years ago when I'd like find a character who was mentally ill in a book. That was kind of like all that was focused upon. All that character was used in order to sort of like show the main character what they must do next. And it's like I wanted to see the character with a mental illness being treated like in their own right, rather than just being sort of like used as a device in a way. Because quite often, sort of like mental illness, like it's quite overpowering when you're writing a character with a mental illness. But yeah, I feel that it should still be treated in exactly the same way as any other character. So yeah, and sort of like working on reducing the stigma around mental health is so important.
Yeah, it's great if you can do it without realizing it. So yeah, I want to do more of that as well. I think it's really important, and also to show that there's such a spectrum,
Yeah.
Because everything you're going to see, like that I can think of anyway, in let's say film, is going to be like the most extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. It's always the most extreme on the spectrum, like you say, because it defines them. Yeah. Whereas you really have this unbelievable spectrum of people. So yeah, I mean, I'm still going to be continuing on, obviously, with the environmental series, and that's really important. But while I'm waiting for these various natural disasters, fires and plagues to hopefully get moved to the rear view mirror, I am also dabbling with this, like, a completely different new one, and yeah, I think because of what's this virus that is taken over so much all over the world, I am going right now for a more escapist. I also just want to write an escapist a situation that's just sort of almost satirical because it's just so exaggerated. And hopefully that's also you have to hit the right note on that so that it doesn't become it's satirical, but it's not cartoonish, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's what I'm doing right now. While the environmental thing is sort of on hold, because the sequel is kind of just waiting. And I want to do this escapist satire. And this one actually takes place of going back to Canada. I've gone all the way around from Israel to South Africa, back to Canada. So that's where I am right now.
Okay. Yeah. So.
But I'm staying in the YA. Like I'm really enjoying that. And like you said, could be in a couple of years. That's not the headspace you're in. I could probably take advantage while I've got all these teens talking around me all the time. They'll grow up eventually.
Yeah.
I will have such a convenient ear. I've got such an ear for it because I've got 4 girls, and then the friends over all the time. So it's just that constant ear, how they think, how they talk, which is really useful.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. Or I just frankly ask them. I just say, like, if that girl looked at your boyfriend, would you say that? And they'll go, no one says that. And then they give me some, other phrase that is, of course, spot on. And you were, way off with some old-fashioned phrase. So, now, what do you do for the dialogue? Do you have like a teenager that you?
Yeah. So like in my beta reading team, I've got sort of like a couple of they're sort of like they're late teens now, but they've got younger siblings who are sort of like in the teenage demographic now, that's like more traditionally fitting for young adult. So yeah, they're sort of like, if there's anything that my beta readers think like doesn't quite sound right, they will then ask their younger siblings as well. So yeah, just like checking the dialogue. Like I hadn't realized like because I'm in like my mid-20s and I thought like I still had like quite a good ear for like how teenagers like yeah. And it was only when I was getting like all this feedback on like my latest manuscript that I realized how much it has changed. And because like going back to like the social media thing, like I was still like writing as if like Facebook and Twitter were like the main social medias that they choose to use, but like obviously that's not the case. So but yeah, just
you can see even between them. You can see between like the 18-year-old and the 13-year-old. They're already not using the same.
Yeah.
The language is just unbelievable. How
it does change so much.
It's just at this phenomenal. You can just see the differences between them. They're already like, the 18-year-old will be like, oh, sorry. Because if the younger one goes, no one says that, no one does that, everything, whether it's fashion, the celebrities they follow, these people on Instagram they follow will be different. That what's it called? TikTok.
Oh yeah.
Like that wasn't around, right? If I would ask someone like you weren't sitting around on TikTok.
No, I'm still not really sure what it is, but
so yeah, no. Yeah, you're in the same boat as me already. Sorry.
Yeah, was there anything else that you wanted to say, like when we're talking about global issues in YA before we wrap up the conversation?
I want to encourage writers, if there are writers who think that YA is not serious or not important, to take another look to, as I say, to compare it to acting, and you would never think that in another art form, and particularly now when there seems to be a tremendous amount of pressure on young people, all these different issues coming at them. The books are important. The role models are important. The voices are important. The diversity of voices is important. They should be reading about, I think, don't be afraid to read about a book that takes place in South Africa, to read about a book that takes place in a dystopian world, to read about a book that takes place in the Middle East. And, it's more and more, it's very, very obvious that we're all connected, and it's all connected. It's almost bizarre to think people call it international fiction. It's really almost national at this point in terms of the issues everyone's dealing with. The teens are dealing with similar issues. So the line between national and international is becoming finer and finer in terms of what people need to grapple with and the solutions. So yeah, I think there needs to be more of it. But it doesn't mean you can't write a fun story either, just a fun adventure story. I'm not saying that everything has to be serious, but YA is not a genre. It's an age category. And then the genres are wide open.
Yeah, because there's just so much flexibility within YA, because you can have like pretty much any genre that you'd get in an adult, or you can also get like YA sort of like versions of it.
So I think people forget that. They almost think it's a genre.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where like the sort of like stereotypes about like what they think YA is sort of like come from, because they assume that it's only just like one type of story, when that's really not the case.
Yeah, it's just an age category. It's not a genre. So it's wide open, including nonfiction.
Yeah.
Which I think would be in some ways even more challenging. Maybe we'll put that on the list after my one day wanting to query with an entirely different name, and see how that goes.
Well, thank
you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, it's been a really great conversation. So yeah, thank you so much.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. And I hope to see you again and talk about more books.
Yeah, definitely.
Take care.